This episode is brought to you by Camilla Najat with Exit Realty Metro.
Camilla Najat is an experienced real estate agent who prides herself in finding the perfect home for her clients. Camilla can help you with a comparative market analysis to help determine the value of your home if you're planning on selling, or help you determine the going rate for the neighborhood you're moving into. She can also work with you at your pace.
You can reach Camilla by calling 902-880-8429 or email camilla@exitmetro.ca.
Also, you can find her on Facebook at Camilla Najat, Exit Realty Metro.
This is Matt Conrad.
And this is Mike Tobin.
Welcome to the Afternoon Pint.
This week we speak with Professors Ajay Parasram and Alex Khasnabish, authors of the recent publication and YouTube series Frequently Asked White Questions. We strongly encourage you to check out the links in the bio if you're interested in reading or listening to their book on audio, or checking out their YouTube series. We explore two themes from the book over some beers in the Garrison Oxford Tap Room. Enjoy.
Hey guys, cheers.
Cheers.
Welcome to the Afternoon Pint.
Thanks for having us.
Really happy to have you guys here. Had a peek at your book. I must say, I was quite intrigued. I went through it in Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, 4 days.
Wow.
Took me about four evenings, right, after working. That's pretty good. I finished it last night on the beach. The kids were playing at the beach. I'm like, I have to finish this book.
Some light
They're
beach
over here
reading.
so I listened to it at the beach there last night. Absolutely fantastic. But I'd love to get you guys to introduce yourselves first. Just tell me who you are and maybe a little bit about yourselves.
Sure. My name is Ajay Parasram, and I am a Chibuktuk local. Grew up in Dartmouth, just across the bridge there. Went to school since I was 5 years old. Originally from Trinidad and Tobago in the Southern Caribbean. My ancestry came from, indentured laborers, so all the way from India. At the end of slavery in the 19th century, they came as sort of inadvertent replacement laborers. So we were put into a really acrimonious relationship with the African population in the Caribbean, and it kind of speaks to that whole legacy and history from there. And it kind of comes, and then we come here, and I grew up and lived and worked all over unceded territories. Some of them in the East Coast, some in the West Coast, some in the center, and eventually. I currently sell my labor at the university, teaching classes in international development studies and history, neither of which I'm formally trained in. Probably shouldn't have said that. But yeah, that's where I'm at.
Awesome. Yeah. And Alex, man, a bit about yourself.
Yeah, sure. I'm Alex Khasnabish. I am a come from away, but I've been in the province now for 17 years. And my kids were born here, so I figure that gives me some credibility. I come from Southern Ontario, so please forgive me again. But I moved here for work years and years ago and love it. We've lived here ever since. I too sell my labor at a university in this town, but not the same one. I work at the Mount and have for a while now. My people are all back in Toronto, basically. It's where my family still lives, but my mom came here from Latvia. Your listeners might know that as a little tiny country on the Baltic Sea. My dad came from Burma by a very roundabout route, and they met in Toronto. They both sort of came as political and economic refugees. My mom is the whitest person you will ever meet, and my dad was one of the darkest, so they're so-called interracial relationship in Toronto in the 60s and 70s was, a bigger deal than a lot of those relationships are these days. And my sister and I grew up as really kind of generic Canadian kids in that context. And in fact, I'd like to describe myself as ambiguously racialized because honestly, I have the cultural coordinates of a white dude, and yet I have a skin tone and a last name that makes it sometimes harder for me to pass like that in society. Sometimes people ask me questions, sometimes very good-natured, sometimes a little bit more pointed about that. So, that's my background.
Amazing. So, I do know a bit of this story. AJ, I went to high school together, I think. Not junior high, just high school. Right. We met sometime in between grade 10 and 12. I think we were both a little bit different back then, but not.
Yeah.
Our core stayed similar. Like our core values, sure. But what brought you on to write this book?
Yeah. Oh my goodness. So it's a really good question. Technically speaking, what I do for a living is I teach about the 19th century in the other part of the world, in South Asia. So in some ways, this is very far away from what it is I'm supposed to be doing. But what it was it just felt like we were in this political moment, that nobody fully expected. After the Truth and Reconciliation Commission came out with their report in 2015, it seemed like Canadians, broadly speaking, were interested in listening to a new kind of conversation to understand how race has been, kind of working in this country and not working in this country. Right? So since that, it opened that window, and then we had a couple of really specific events that kind of pushed us. I was hearing from my students, where's the progressive alternative perspective and analysis? Because a lot of the people that I'm going to school with are only hearing from folks like Jordan Peterson and there's all this stuff coming from one particular perspective, but we're not hearing the alternatives that you guys are talking about in your classes.
Right.
So it really seemed in that moment, and actually it's interesting, especially for a podcast named like this, Alex and I got together over a hoppy beverage, and maybe you can take it from there, Alex.
For sure. So, I think the project, like AJ was just saying, for me, I do my professional work in a totally different field. I'm a social movement studies person, an anthropologist by training. So, I know about race and racism as a scholar, but it's not the field that I work in. And yet, both of our lived experiences obviously brought us into contact with issues surrounding race and justice in this society, just as people moving through it. But it was maybe the year before the pandemic, or actually it was like a few months leading up to the pandemic. And AJ and I were sitting around having a beer, talking about the state of the world, complaining about things, and just thinking and talking about this new, like you were just saying, AJ, this new kind of populist right kind of vocabulary and way of talking to people that was spreading, especially through social media. Lots of young people, very attracted. It's, it comes across as plain speaking, straight ahead, no nonsense. And we were like, I feel like that they're not telling the right story. They're turning people against each other. How can we do something that will just open up the conversation to different kinds of perspectives and invite people in who sometimes don't feel like they can make mistakes and not get into a whole lot of trouble for it while they're figuring shit out. So we wanted to create a context where we could do that.
And I think that's something, people want to do good stuff. I think there's a capacity for many people to do good. I think, Matt, you'd agree, sometimes it's a little scary. Sometimes you're afraid, hey, look, I want to defend people, but I don't want to defend them in the wrong way, or get marked the wrong way, or lose my job. Right? A bunch of fears can come out the moment you really you go out there to defend. Yeah, and sometimes some are realistic, but a lot of them are not.
And I think it's important to kind of ask these questions, because I think lack of communication is what leads to a lot of some of the more negative things that can happen. It's I don't want to get too political, but it's one of those things where we'll leave it at certain people who get voted in. Get voted in because they say one thing, but it's a dog whistle for other things. For sure. And people think, well, I like that idea because you can't come out and say I don't like immigrants. Right. You just can't do that because you know how that will react. However, you can say things like, where are we going to put all of them? We should take care of our own here first. We can say things like that. And it's like, well, okay, where are we going to put people is a good question to ask. Sure. Why are you asking it, though?
Why are you asking it?
Why are you asking it? Because, I think how the conversation should start is immigration is good.
Yeah.
But where are we going to put everyone who's coming here?
Yeah. Sure.
Things like that.
Those are reasonable, practical questions.
Yeah. Reasonable, practical questions. And I actually don't think and some people talk about they took my jobs and all that stuff. As people come here, to me, economy will tell you, there's more people to service.
Yeah.
There's more people to do jobs. They come with skills.
Yeah.
All of this stuff. Like, that's never been a worry of mine. And so we should start the conversation with immigration is good.
Right.
Let's make sure we do it
Right.
well.
right. Yeah.
So,
exactly.
But this is the thing is like when we don't communicate and don't have people who can answer these questions and have people who can ask them, then what happens is they get trapped in these dog whistle people who are saying, "Make America great again."
Right.
Yeah.
And I ask, when was America great?
Right.
When was it great? And for who? Right?
Yeah.
So it's those types of things that I find quite
And
interesting.
I think, in the last 8 years, I think more than any other time, certainly in the 21st century, people have been siloed, right? And it's been really difficult to talk to people who don't already echo the kind of things that you did, that you already think. So it really compounds that effect. I've had some students do some really great research with me on propaganda and I know, Alex, this is a big part of your work too, but it struck us that we really wanted to find a way to help people speak outside of the silos and across to one another, and it reflects a lot of the other kinds of work that we do in the city too, which is really about trying to bring people to make people understand that it's not a problem if you don't agree with one another about everything.
Right.
That you can have
100%.
solid, you don't
100%.
have to agree. We should not agree about everything.
I loved your book for that reason. I was reading it, and there's nothing better when you read something and you turn it off for a minute and your brain just starts going, because you're thinking about what he said. No, I don't know if I agree with it. And but then you're rationally kind of going through it in your own head. No, we'll break down what it meant. And arrive at their conclusion instead of your predetermined one, and see how you feel then. Do you feel differently? And this book did that a lot, which was great, and I really appreciated that, that kind of experience. Well, we'll just going through that book, right? I think I said it was really a beginner's guide to anti-racism, right? True anti-racism. Read through it, you're starting to get a little kind of. Just some thoughts to start, sparks to really kind of go and explore on your own to however you want to help. If you do in fact want to help be anti-racist, there was a lot of great avenues where you could start. And I think you guys would agree, one thing the book really hit home was a lot of it was doing your own research.
Oh yeah, I guess so. Yeah. Certainly.
I think other thing too though is what you so that everyone who may be listening can understand the difference, and because there's a large difference between being not racist and being anti-racist. I don't know if you guys want to let everybody know the difference between that.
Sure,
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think it's a great question, and I think particularly in a country that kind of prides itself on its civic traditions and its sense of multiculturalism and all of this. When you start to talk about questions of race and racism, often people, can get their backs up because they're like, "Hey, what are you saying? This society, it's not a good one. Why isn't it a good one?" People can feel very personally implicated in that. And one of the things that we really wanted to just put out on the table from the get-go was that, this is not about blaming and shaming individuals for bad behavior. Sometimes that has to happen, of course, within friend groups and families and all that kind of stuff. But it's really not about setting up another us versus them dichotomy, right? With good folks on one side and villains on the other. And I think that when talking about the difference between being just not racist and being actively anti-racist, one of the points that we make in the book is that, white supremacy and white supremacist racism is something that white people had to be organized into, right? That not something that they come into the world espousing or feeling or believing. And in fact, the whole idea of whiteness, just like the idea of blackness or brownness or whatever, is just, it's sort of a made-up idea.
It's invisible.
Yeah,
it's invisible in every facet of society. You don't really recognize it until you really take some time.
Right.
And
until you encounter it in
your
you come up against those cutting edges if you're one of those people who finds themselves being part of an identity that, that is outside of the most privileged in that particular order, right? So
in times like this, it's really difficult for people to look inwards because we are going through an economic time now where there's a lot more people having trouble financially.
For sure,
And there's a lot more people saying, what the heck? I used to be comfortable and have everything. They're looking for somebody to blame.
And this is kind of how these things kind of work together, right? Like you mentioned earlier, that example about they took our job kind of thing. It becomes really easy to point at the most vulnerable people and say that they took our job, when actually what's happening structurally are, it's like a high level of elite interest being organized through class, through through race to some extent, but like in that case mostly through class, that leads working class people who are conservative or liberal or radical or whatever to then embrace the dog whistle and then say, well, the lowest hanging fruit is that these are, like immigrants are doing this. Well, actually, immigrants aren't doing that. It's actually, the organization of our economy, which is much deeper, much longer.
I didn't know the immigrants don't own like Walmart.
That's right.
They don't own the superstore. Like this, the way that our lives are structured can be really shitty for all kinds of people, and that's one of the points we really wanted to make in the book. That because sometimes I think very well-intentioned anti-racism can come across really moralistically, self-righteously, and in a kind of denunciating fashion. And I'm not trying to throw any activist under the bus for that, but sometimes we've all been there. Certainly AJ and I, we write about this in the book, and we talk about this like on both sides of things, but we've all been in a room where like the dynamic you were describing before, somebody, an important issue is being discussed, somebody feels accused or attacked, they get defensive, becomes an argument about that. They're two sides fighting over semantics, definitions, whether or not somebody's being unfair or mean, and nothing gets, there's a lot of heat and absolutely no light. And one thing we wanted to do was to take some of the pressure away from that, because I think for a lot of well-intentioned white people, they are afraid of making a mistake in those settings, and sometimes for very good reasons, for those reasons I just described, of being denounced or called out because you used the wrong word or you don't understand something. And so one thing AJ and I wanted to do with this book was to take the pressure off of racialized folks who are dealing with this every day, but also activists who are asked to do this a lot, this popular education stuff in anti-racist
part of what we're trying to espouse in the book is that if we choose not to be kind of like fragile and defensive about being wrong, it is actually possible to be curious and excited and engaged about learning from the opportunities that good mistakes offer. And it's like a really, and Alex is right, and I think maybe for the listeners, it's probably worth mentioning, the book we didn't just start writing the book.
I was gonna when you said show, I was like, oh God, we gotta talk about the origins of the show.
We should talk about this show.
Go back, please, and tell them how this started.
So we initially, after we had that hoppy drink, we didn't go straight into a book. We actually created a show that's called Safe Space for White Questions. And this show, we had a rocky start in some ways. The pandemic played a part in that.
Because, it was March 2020.
March 2020 was our first show. So we started in person, and then obviously immediately had to switch to an online venue. And, we're not technologically savvy people.
No.
So we did a few episodes, and we limped through it. And then Fernwood Publishing saw what we were trying to do, and then said, yo, let us take care of this tech. You guys are doing a terrible job, but it's a cool idea, right?
We were helped.
We were helped,
and we needed so much help.
So we've probably got like 20 episodes or so in the bag now. It's all free. It's all available.
Oh, wow. It's all up on Fernwood Publishing's YouTube channel. Yeah, we've got
Fernwood Publishing's YouTube channel.
Yeah,
we'll put a link to it on this episode.
That's cool. And actually, the book comes out of the episodes, and one of the things that working with Fernwood allowed us to do was to have this amazing. So if folks go to that channel, any episode you play, you can obviously watch/listen to the whole thing, but all the questions are time-stamped and indexed, so you can also
full transcripts.
There's something, so we've got complete transcripts there for folks who'd rather read or can't avail themselves of the visual or the audio, and it just ended up being a really good resource for us when we were provoked to write a book by friends and a particular.
The kind of repetition, right? Like
people are like, you're answering the same questions all the time.
And it got me thinking, you're asking about the origins of this, and I was thinking, like, there, probably back in, like, 2015 or so.
Yeah.
I remember just taking a break for a year and a half from Facebook. Just because I would get so many questions from, like, white male friends in particular, not exclusively, but in particular, just private messaging me, direct messaging me, to interrogate me about things that I was posting and sharing in my feed. And they were like, well, what about this? What about this? What about this? Or can you explain it? And it was just like, eventually it just got too much.
Yeah. Right.
And when I came back to it, I came back with a desire to say, like, look, I do believe that everybody has a right to have their questions answered.
Right.
But this is completely, it was exhausting me, and I didn't make any progress in my research for a year and a half because of it, right? So there's a very real material cost to that.
Yep.
And I decided I am never going to answer a question one-on-one. Almost never will I answer a question one-on-one in private on this subject. But if it's about race and whiteness and masculinity and that sort of thing, I am happy to answer any question in a public format.
Sure.
So I just only started, like, everything I post now is public, and all the engagements are public. And it was, for me anyway, the antecedent through which I was like, okay, let's talk out loud about this. If we're going to try and shift the culture to make it okay to have, like, frank and compassionate conversations about really difficult things, we have to actually do that in our lives, right?
Sure, yeah.
So we start enacting that, and then, like, people come and meet you. Like, people will step up to this, right? So Alex is right. Like, I mean, the content from this book, a lot of it came out of people who were willing to step up and say, I don't know what this means, like, what's the difference between cultural appropriation and cultural appreciation? Like, this, these are big questions.
I think that's a common one that comes out. That's one of the most common ones, because those lines get blurred often, right? Like, a lot of people are thinking, like, no, I love this, and or, like, I love that or this or whatever,
Right.
and they think, like, no, I'm paying homage to this, and sometimes it's just like, you gotta maybe just ignorant to the history or something like that.
Yeah.
And it's, it's kind of funny that we're doing. So I was really excited about this podcast. I've been talking about it since we got it set up, and it's kind of cool that we're doing this podcast on this day, because today is Norman Lear's 101st birthday. Norman Lear did the Jeffersons, All in the Family. Like, he was the guy who did, like, tons of shows in the 70s and 80s. And he was a lead, like, he led social movements. And some of the things that kind of take away, All in the Family is one of my favorite TV shows of all time. And the reason being is, it really hammers home the fact, like, the different face of racism. Or just bigotry in general, right? Because Archie, pretty endearing guy, but obviously says some pretty messed up stuff, even for back then, right? And it's one of those things where, you can look at this guy who has these, like, bigoted type opinions, but it doesn't seem like it comes from a place of hate. He says to Lionel, right? Lionel Jefferson. It's like, Lionel, I'm a nice guy. Why you do this to me? I let you even use my front door. Like, that's a line that he used in the show, right? And so he's like, he loves Lionel. It's buddies. I let you use my front door, right? Like, when society would hate that. And it's one of those things where, Archie is, if people think, like, oh, racism, like, that's the bad guy. Sometimes it's just the ignorant guy. And he needs to know more, right? And I think all of us, like, all I can know is my perspective. And that's why I appreciate talking to you guys, right? Because that's all I know. We need to know your perspective.
And I think the step that we try and push people to take in the book is that, yes, like, sometimes it's ignorance, but let's look at the root causes of that ignorance, right?
There you go.
Because people have been organized into that ignorance. There's a political project underneath that spans 100 years.
And through...
if not greater. More than 100 years. It's the foundation of Western society.
Your environment, your upbringing is certainly going to... Your whole life. I mean, life to me was very different once I left Halifax, Nova Scotia, and traveled a little bit, versus just hanging around Dartmouth in high school, right? So the more you explore, the more places you've seen, the more people you've met, can greatly expand on your mind, right? Greatly. But you still need a lot of help. Right?
When we went to high school, man, there was like 5 brown people in our high school. You know what I mean?
Crazy. All I'll have one more of the light beer.
Tom, the amber.
They're fantastic.
Another one of these. Yeah.
So we're taking a quick beer intermission.
Beer intermission.
Another juicy.
Yeah, so we're having the Little Juicy IPA. We're having the Hoppy Boy and the Tall Ship Amber here at the Oxford Tap Room. So
We're supposed to do it at the beginning.
we were supposed to do the beginning. Well, we jumped to it because we were really excited. But there you go. This is a good intermission to talk about beer.
Right.
But yeah. Anyway, yeah. Sorry. So we were talking about the foundations of.
Western civilization. Yeah. Beer had a lot to do with that too.
That's right.
There you go.
High school, 5 brown guys.
Yeah, maybe. Like I'm thinking, like I was actually looking through my elementary school yearbook the other day because I happened to find it, and I just for fun I counted visible minorities that were just purely visible. It was me, and it was one guy who a bunch of white kids made us fight each other one time.
Wow.
I mean, that's
What grade was that?
I was in grade primary. He would have been in grade 1. I actually wrote a short story about it called "Seeing White in the Margins."
Oh my god!
It was like a wild, like, but just like how different things are now, even from then. It was just like what was considered normal, in the late 80s and early 90s. It was just stuff like this story, like this is a bit of a tangent, but the story I wrote is a 2-page story, and it connects like my ancestry as somebody coming from India to this kid who was African Nova Scotian, and then his ancestry to the first black man in the British Empire to win the Victoria Cross for bravery. Mm-hmm. And when I was doing that research, I realized that the first black man in the British Empire to win that won it in the First War of Independence in India, fighting with the British against the Indians in 1857.
Yeah, let's talk about
and I was just thinking, I was like, wow, literally, my great-great-great-great-great-great-grandparents could have been fighting this guy's great-great-great-great-grandparents, and the only person's interest was the British Empire. So,
Right.
it's not my king. So, like, screw the British monarchy for so many reasons.
Yeah.
Right.
But, like, one of them reasons is that, like, they were made just as we as children in the playground were made to fight each other for the sport of structural white supremacy, so too were our ancestors made to fight each other. Right. And it was just, it's just these kinds of things that as a kid you can't possibly understand that. Right? I didn't understand any of that as a kid. But as like a grown-ass man, like I think back on these things, and then it's like, there's actually a lot of stuff. It means a lot, I think, being local to Halifax and like writing. This is one of the reasons why we wanted to write so much about Halifax, where we could write about Nova Scotia, write about Canadian context.
I love the direct relations to the Cornwallis statue. A lot of the controversies that went here.
Right.
Are you selling the book in Canada only, or are you selling it abroad?
It's international, so you can get it anywhere. Yeah.
So that's actually
Thanks, man.
that's actually something.
Appreciate it.
Cheers. Thank you.
For trading that other glass, so I can
Sure
grab that
thing.
from you.
There you go.
Thank you.
Yes.
So that is something that's pretty interesting, and obviously like the Cornwallis thing was like hot topic and lots of controversy. I mean, I'm kind of at a point now where it's just like, let's just stop naming things after people. Let's just stop.
Are we even doing that?
Yeah, like, come on now, right? Unless you're gonna pay for it yourself and you're gonna name it after you, like, let's stop naming things after people because it's just it hasn't been working out super great.
Our high school.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Prince Andrew didn't turn out to be such a good fellow.
No.
Yes, my God.
So so it is interesting. It's a pretty hot topic about that stuff, and what I kind of find really interesting is that there's the two sides of it where people talk about like education and not forgetting history and all that stuff, which is all really, really good. But I find like when you get both sides of that argument, like when whoever's pro and con, they both kind of say the same sentence with. Again, we were talking earlier with different intentions.
Right.
I don't know. Like, I mean, it. Some people were all up in arms, and I was just kind of when it was coming down and when they were taking the statue down, I was just kind of like, who cares? Honestly, I was just like, I don't know him. It's not my family member or whatever. I don't care. Like, I don't know the guy. And like, honestly, I didn't even know the statue was there until people started making a big deal about it.
Right.
I think that's how a lot of people felt, probably.
You're right. But the minute someone was like,
it's what it
hey, we're
represents,
taking it
right?
down,
Yeah.
everyone was like, I probably, I'm not saying I took a survey, but I
Yeah.
would guarantee that most of the people who were upset about that didn't know that statue
Yeah.
was there.
They probably didn't know who Wallace was.
No, absolutely.
Let's be real.
But I mean, I think
it was just this outrage for no a cause that, and I think that happens a lot, right? And it's really scary. And it's social media now. I mean, that's the worst for these siloed attacks on things without context.
Yeah.
And that's probably the most disgusting. And it also probably makes, in its defense, make some things look worse than they actually are. Right? I mean, it's a radicalized group that happens to be the loudest group and a small group, right? And they can...
Yeah, social media is like the two tropes that are used most often, the echo chamber and the filter bubble, right? And
Yes.
it's definitely both of those things. And it can make, it makes every good debate incoherent and super angry. And it, because of the way those platforms have been designed from the ground up, they ride on controversy to gain viewership and to keep people
Even
on.
the individual subscriber.
Oh yeah,
right?
and they absolutely know what they're like. You hear about these engineers who work at the platforms who are like, I don't have an account because I don't want to be roped into. So it's and I think people with the best of intentions, and I'm not saying people shouldn't be on social media or using it or whatever, because lots of good conversations, as AJ was saying earlier, happen there too. But it does, if you are thinking that that's where life is lived, then that's a starting mistake, right? Because I think you can have all kinds of good communication over those channels, raise awareness about certain kinds of things, get in contact with people, but if you're really thinking about the way like life is structured and our lives are lived and who we're, how we figure out how we're going to get through the day, you do that like in a very physical, material way with the people all around you. And if you're not in those spaces, having those conversations face to face sometimes, with coworkers, with neighbors, with family members, then, that change is not going to go anywhere but beyond that very limited number of followers you've got on whatever platform you happen to be occupying, I think.
Yeah, that's the interesting thing about social media, and we were talking about this the other day about how I kind of feel like social media has a lot of positives that it can offer. It can unite a lot of people. I can keep in touch with people all around the world that I would normally probably not be able to, and things like that, and keep track of their their lives without having to make a phone call or send an email or something like that, right? You can keep instant contact with people and still feel like you're a part of people. But at the same time, it also gives a platform for a lot of people who probably shouldn't be able to gather so easily, right? So there's also that. So there's the good and bad for it.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, and I think you're hitting the nail on the head, really. We were actually having a conversation with our partners about this last night, too, having some drinks and chatting about the effects of social media. But one of the things, and it comes up in the book a few times, but it comes up on our show all the time, and it's this trope that floats around all kinds of articles about this idea of being denied a platform, right? And it's true, as you're pointing out, right? I mean, and I say this as a university professor who regularly gets ignored by his students. Not everybody earns or deserves a platform, right? I mean, one thing social media I think is really distorted is the sense that we are all entitled to have our views aired publicly and to the greatest degree possible, even if we don't know what we're talking about. So, I'm not sort of waxing poetic for a time when we had editors very, like keeping all of our voices out of the public sphere. But I do think, one of the things we're grappling with right now is just how confusing these kinds of digitally mediated conversations can be when everybody is like shouting at one another and actually very few people are listening.
Right.
Yeah.
I just spent 6 hours trying to install a microwave. I have no business making a YouTube video about how to install a microwave. That should have been a 45-minute job. You know what I mean?
Okay. Yeah, that's a good point. That's a good point. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
It's so. I guess what would you say to people who are just kind of starting this journey of trying to be truly kind of aware of being anti-racist and things like that? What would you Like I'm sitting here in front of you, and I'm like, okay, guys, like, what can I do tomorrow? Wake up tomorrow. What can I do to like start that journey? Obviously, it's a long journey. It's but like, I don't know. What's that first step forward? What would you suggest to somebody?
Yeah, thanks for that. That's such a great question, and it's one that we love getting. And
buy their book.
Other than that, buy the book.
Chapter.
we do have a whole chapter about this because it's such an important question, right? But like, there's a couple of different ways, right? And, like, not everybody likes to read. If you like to read, there's lots of good readings to do, but not everybody likes to read. You don't need to read. I would hazard to say you don't need to read a damn word to start getting organized around this stuff. First thing you do, I would say, is turn up to like a rally or a demonstration that somebody else is organizing. And don't try to, just turn up. Just be there. Be present. Especially around anti-racist organizing, it is actually extremely important to have white bodies in particular present.
Yeah.
I've been at so many, especially Black Lives Matters rallies, I Don't Know More style rallies, where people have said, where are the white people? And I think it's a really important point because, no white people as an individual chose to have the privilege that you were talking about.
Yeah.
And yet it is something that everybody probably needs to be accountable for our place in the world. And it's not about like you have to do this. It's like if you don't want other people naming and contorting what your subjectivities in the public, then turn up to these things, not to do anything more initially than to simply be counted and to be present, to hear what's happening.
And imagine if you could harness the power of corporations. I mean, we see now every month a corporation will state,
jump on a cause.
Oh yeah,
right.
And then the next month it's gone.
Exactly.
Yeah. So it's like, okay, that's cool, but like, what maybe the next step for us, organizations we work for. If there is an organization, getting that whole work team down there.
You can learn a lot just from turning up and doing stuff, right? And I use the example. I don't think I talked about it in the book, but like, when we were first starting to get to know each other, it was in large part organizing against fascism in the wake of Trump.
Sure.
And then around Cornwallis, actually, the Cornwallis statue.
Okay.
My partner and I had just moved back to Chibuktuk. I hadn't lived here for a decade at that point. So I didn't know people the way that I did. I was just starting to meet people again. And I heard they were rallying around the Cornwallis statue, and Mi'kmaq people were leading that. So
What year was that?
That would have been 2017, I think. 2016, 2017.
When that first kind of all started?
Yeah. And then, we didn't know what to do. We didn't know people, right?
Right.
So we just were like, what can we do? And we thought, they're going to have a rally. We know that there's a Mi'kmaq Warrior Fund. We know that people are fighting court cases. They're going to need money. We don't have any money, but we know how to make a mean pakora. So we literally made like 400, 500 pakoras at home in our little apartment and just loaded up a massive box of them. And then we borrowed a table from somebody. We turned up at the park, set up a thing. We named ourselves Solidarity Pakora. And it was just pakoras, vegetable, vegan, gluten-free pakoras by donation
to
the Warrior Fund.
Beautiful.
And not only did we raise, like a nice chunk of change, $200 that we then were able to walk over and hand to the Mi'kmaq Warriors and say, look, we don't know each other, but here's some money that came from selling this.
That's cool.
And we got to introduce like Mi'kmaq elders to our culture in a way.
Yeah,
right? Like they'd never
yeah.
had a pakora. I remember one person asking me if it was moose, and I was like, my Brahmin relations will tell you there's no moose or any animal in this particular pakora. It's like,
okay, I love that because I actually firmly believe that there's a lot you can learn from cultures through food. And so when COVID first hit, and everyone was like home and locked up, my wife and I were like, we like food. Like we've taken some cooking classes and stuff like that, and we're like, what can we do to help pass this time? So we decided every Wednesday to research a different culture's food and make it.
Cool.
And we learned so much about that.
Right on.
Like that.
You talk to the culture too, not just the food.
You got
into it, man.
We got into it.
I've known Matt for a very long time.
It's like we got right into it. We learned more about it. Like there's just some crazy things that you learn, and then sometimes you have more questions because you're like, what?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, of course.
But it was the coolest thing to learn through food about other people, and you can connect so well. And actually, Indian food's actually my favorite food.
Right.
And I was having a really good conversation, like I mentioned earlier, a guy who has the same name as you at work.
Right, yeah.
And I got having a really good conversation with him about 2 weeks ago.
Yeah.
About food, and I was like, Indian food's my favorite food, kind of thing, right? And he was explaining that some of the good restaurants he likes, but he was also saying about how a lot of Indian people don't go to restaurants because we just make all our food. It's really authentic, and I was like, that sounds awesome. And then he surprised me with lunch one day. Brought me in something his wife made that he was eating and everything, and I was just like, this is awesome, right? So it's just that, like, I don't know, there's a whole I don't know, maybe full bellies is the way we defeat racism. I don't know.
It's a cliche,
if
but
full bellies globally would defeat everything.
We'd be all right.
But people connecting over sharing food and or beer, having a drink together, like that is like the breaking of bread, right? To talk about the Judeo-Christian tradition is super, like that's super important, and for lots of good reasons. And I think what AJ is just reflecting on there is super important, because a lot of what we think of when we think about social change work, especially if you're like a person like me who's further away from those cutting edges. You're like, it's very abstract, it's philosophical, maybe I feel bad about myself, I feel bad about, the fact that my life isn't characterized by the suffering that I see around me. But getting lost in that kind of like navel gazing is just as bad as feeling super defensive around it, right? Like all you end up is self-flagellating, right? So the question becomes, like what can I do in the place that I am, like where I live, where my feet stand on this ground, that makes a meaningful contribution? And like the first steps in that, it's going to be like starting anything. If you're just picking up baseball, or you're taking up a martial art for the first time, or you're learning how to play pool, you're going to suck. Is going to be hard. People will make a fool of you sometimes, and that's what learning is. But it's that feeling like all you're making is a humble contribution is actually a great thing. That's how we think about what we're doing with the book and the podcast.
Yeah, I read, Alex, you yourself studied a lot of martial arts and different styles over the years.
Yes, I'm a big fan of Brazilian
He pointed to his
right
shine.
Yes, and I mean I use that example in the book too.
It's a great example.
Where we're talking about cultural appreciation, and because there is this, it's one of these lines that gets weaponized very abstractly, right? When people argue about it, they're like, well, you don't have the right to, because you're not identity X, right?
Sure.
And I mean, as an anthropologist, I guess this is where I'll wave my degree around. I'll say, like people have been exchanging food, beer, ideas, technology, like all kinds of things for as long as there have been people on this planet, right? So the question is not, is it okay to share and learn from other people?
No.
The question is, under what terms is that like an honorable and dignified thing to do? And under what terms is that a shitty, exploitative, appropriative thing? So if I'm like, I'm going to start my own shop in Halifax to sell, I don't know, exotic wares that I pick up on my travels every, once a year. And, that probably tends toward the more exploitative side. I don't, unless I'm building real relationships with the people that I'm engaging. But if I'm, in good faith, learning a martial art, or learning a language, or learning how to cook food, or a cultural dance or something, and that that's a sincere and humble desire that I'm bringing myself to honestly and be willing to learn about, then that's great. That's legit. That's how we break down those barriers between people.
And hey, look at the self part of it, right? If you're looking to self-fulfill, look outward, right? I mean, every time you'll never feel worse by trying to help someone else, right? Like,
that's a good point.
Or trying to learn something new, right?
Absolutely.
The more foods you can cook, or whatever it may be.
It can be a humbling thing too. Like I feel like humility is something that we're lacking in society. Like there's so much fronting. People feel the need to front. Like I'm not going to get a job if I don't front. This person is not going to respect me if I don't front.
And social media is like the gasoline on that fire.
Instagram and stuff. It's just we are losing an element of our core common humanity through the constant need to put up a front that hides who we actually are and what we think.
Yeah, I think being humble is something I really try to do. I mean,
it's a life ambition.
I work on it. Yeah, when I get to I try to find my ground again. Right?
In a way, like whole, like Buddhism, Jainism, right? Like there's thousands of years of effort towards really just humility.
Just wrestling with it.
How can I just be humble? It's actually really hard. Because like our nature, to some extent, I hate arguments about human nature. I should say, but
the primal fight or whatever. Yeah.
But I'm also a father, so I cannot deny like watching like what appears to be like when a kid is less than 2 years old. They are self-interested. Only self-interested.
It's amazing when they shift away from that.
Yeah. My kids learning empathy now.
For a second that they're like, oh my God, is something wrong? Am I like, what am I doing wrong? And this kid not give a crap about that kid.
Yeah,
right.
I know.
Like,
how could you be so callous?
All of a sudden, it's just like, and it starts to switch over, and the empathy starts to come, and you're like, okay, I am teaching these things. And your book was about teaching kids to be anti-racist. I think that's great. I think that's something you can help the next generation, and you can teach your kids the right ways and the wrong ways to deal, whether it's a little joke or that's made at the dinner table by maybe a funny uncle, right, or a friend, or something else. You'll hear words every day in your life that is a slight towards somebody when you kind of step out, right? Realistically, you do, right? And to constantly have those discussions. The RETARD word came up the other day from somebody else in conversation, and talked about it, right? And that's what you have to do whenever you hear it.
Sometimes it can be as simple as holding the line, right? I think we talked about it in the book. Like, I've been just quietly washing dishes at my in-laws' house for 21 years now. And it's been a slow battle, but I've seen now, after 20 years, because we went through so many emotions, right? I didn't know what to do. I was like 20 at the time, right? I was like, I don't know, but like the patriarchy is horrible. So, just like trying to help out your mother-in-law at one level, and then, but it can at times appear that you're like a gender traitor, right? Just for something as simple as like doing the dishes.
You got made fun of for that.
Got made fun of. I was ridiculed by all the uncles and stuff.
Like,
really?
Yeah, just for doing the dishes.
Wow.
Like, just for doing,
and this is what you were. So you were saying, like in the book, and this, and talking about educating kids and stuff like that. I think that's really key to, and we're in these times right now where there's like this anti of that. It's like the keep your politics out of schools, and it's like the education with the LGBTQ plus, and it's like don't teach my kid that, and it's like but it's like you're what's the word that they call it? I can't remember what it is, but like you're prepping them for things.
Grooming them.
Thank you.
Exactly.
It's not even in my vocabulary.
They're totally appropriate.
So the whole thing about grooming. But here's the thing, though. It's like, no, we're not grooming kids. We're just teaching them to not be shitty adults.
I know.
Like, we're just trying
the
to make
dignity
them...
of other human beings.
Right.
Is not something
that we should pay attention to.
And not something that, this discourse of parental rights, and I say this as a parent, my eldest just turned 16, we've got another one at home who's 11. I've been doing this for a while, but I don't, they're not my chattel property, I don't get to be like, don't inform this one about the nature of gravity. And don't tell that one about, how many planets there are in the solar system.
That's right.
Like, this discourse of parental rights has been really weaponized to be totally counter to our public life. Because, the public space is somewhere where we need to have debates around, in a good
public space,
society.
but also one-on-one, because you can help a perspective that just by talking to somebody.
Absolutely.
And you can change it really quick.
Yeah.
And sometimes you got to get on their level.
Yeah.
Right? So it's like, okay, you don't want them to teach LGBTQ stuff in school. All right. Well, if that's what you fear, let me tell you something much scarier.
Yeah.
What about if they learn it from some... They were already feeling that way, but they had no idea that these feelings were normal and they were now enabled by somebody from outside of the world that was much older and shouldn't have been there in the first place and manipulated them into doing an act that was, you know.
Yeah, the internet is full of all kinds of dark corners
so it's
these days, right?
Jesus, it's like, I want them to teach my kids this stuff. I'm completely of the mindset. I want you to know everything is out there and everything's okay. And I want you to know how to be smart and how to be safe and how to navigate in difficult conversations. Yeah. How it's okay to be uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Right?
I think being okay with discomfort is like actually a huge social virtue that we have not fully grasped as a society. You know?
Well, you know, as a lifelong sales guy, that's like the best thing, because we're so used to being uncomfortable. We're almost never comfortable, because you go and you knock on a door, you talk to a business or whatever it might be. Yeah, sales is a great attitude for that.
I strongly believe, as a sidebar, that 80% of the success that I've had in convincing anybody of anything is because I was a sales guy for 7 years.
Oh yeah, you were at Tip Top?
I was at Tip Top.
Yeah. So
you were
Matt was in the suit game.
I did Moores for 5 years.
I was in the suit game.
We were all selling suits.
So I did Moores for 5 years, and I worked at Duggars for a year.
Did you?
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Back
I
in
was
my early
salivating
20s
at the Duggars stuff. Oh my gosh.
Oh yeah, no, it was a great place to work for. Yeah, that's for sure. But,
I worked all over the country for Tip Top for a time. Yeah.
Oh wow. Awesome. Yeah. So that's the thing. It's like, I think the education is really, really key, and it is about, you know, creating that next generation, right?
Yeah.
And educating them and just teaching people to be kind.
Yeah.
Just be kind. But the thing that I will say is, I saw this quote years ago, and then it recently just kind of popped up, and I think I shared it with you. It was I'm going to get it wrong, but the idea sticks with me quite. But it's basically a quote that says, "It's okay for us to agree with each other, as long as your opinion doesn't root in my lack of humanity."
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And that's,
sounds like Baldwin or something.
I think that's So I read that and I was like, yeah, that's where I am.
Yeah.
That's where I am. I'll have a conversation with people anytime. I love having conversations with people about whether it's difference of opinions or just views on the world. But if you're basically against the existence of somebody,
right.
it's like, where can we go from here?
Yeah, exactly.
Unless you're willing to bend.
Yeah.
And it has to be them.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's such an important point, right? That when we come down to it, at the end of the day, it's a question of recognizing our mutual dignity, right? That's what you want people to see, and you want people. They don't have to we don't have to like each other, as we say in the book. You know, one of the liberating things about coming to a resolute anti-racist perspective is that everybody gets to be an asshole. There are no people born into the world who are saints or sinners. Not by virtue of their genetics. That's something that lots of individuals are either wonderful or intolerable. Often some combination of those characteristics. But we're not talking about you being awful and debased because you were born into some degree of security and privilege. And we're not talking about you being awesome because you were debased, oppressed, and exploited. But our goal should be to remove that from society, so we don't have a society characterized by these gross inequalities and unjust relationships that either grind up our humanity, make people incredibly resentful towards that, what passes for the normal, the status quo, or and alternatively, weaponize those people at the top of the pyramid to think that everybody below them is some form of human garbage, right? So, when we end up in a world like that, it's like that road rage, the endless road rage memes that we see on Instagram, right? There's this one going around right now that I'm totally addicted to because people have done some hilarious. I don't know if you guys have seen it. It's this guy who's just enraged. Somebody took his parking spot and he's trying desperately. He's punching at the window of the car.
Oh yes.
It's super scary. Super scary because he's really angry.
Yeah.
But I actually feel for this guy in that moment because he's punching so hard and that window's not breaking. And now hundreds and thousands of people have weaponized it.
That's right. Now, I don't know, did you see the one the East Coast version of that?
Yes.
Hilarious, because the guy is literally, he's punching this thing and it's going doof, 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 and all of a sudden it's like, heave away. So you're right. They weaponized
but that kind of, that experience of sort of rage at the world, right? At being so angry about a parking spot. That's something that, that we all touch at some point. The frustrations of our modern existence. The shit that
life is hard, man.
I mean, we've been living through plague, wildfires, floods, economic
Locusts are
uncertainty.
next
Yeah, exactly. All this stuff, and that touches everybody. And I think you were talking about history, you were talking about educating the next generation. I think, and just to circle back to our where we got going on Cornwallis, I think this is exactly it. It's not because what critics will say is it's about removing history and doing away with all those things that set us up for where we are now. And I think our response would be, and the response of a lot of other people is, it's actually quite the opposite of that. It's to recognize that the histories we've been told are extremely partial and often that Cornwallis statue didn't even go up to the 1930s. And why did it go up in the 30s? Because the city elders wanted to convince everybody that we're all in the midst of economic deprivation.
History's written by the victors, right? History's written by the victors.
So it's not even a mark. It's not really an acknowledgement of the founding of the city. It's actually a ruling class monument dating from one of the greatest periods of economic insecurity and tribulation in the last century. So, it's like those moments where it's like, well, what were they afraid of then? Well, they were afraid of black workers and Asian workers and white workers all coming together and figuring out that their interests weren't being served, right?
Removing a statue like that of that nature is a part of evolution, and it's good and it's healthy. I'm a big science fiction guy, and I love it when you're in the future and the thought of everyone's together and they're just fighting an alien race. Right? There's always another race.
Yeah, there's always got to be somebody else.
Right. But great shows like, my gosh, what's that one that, I forget what it's called now. It's on Disney Plus, I think. Seth MacFarlane does it.
That's
the Orville.
Yeah.
It's a comedy. But it's really nice, like the idea of a higher class of society where not that things were behind us, but things were recognized, respected, understood, equal.
Yeah, right.
And we were just now moving on to something entirely better, exploring the universe. Isn't that a beautiful thought, right?
Star Trek always did that.
That stuff's in
the idea of the Vulcans and all that.
You can be who you want to be as long as you don't harm another human being.
And I think that kernel is so good and so important. And I think in some ways, like it's a trope that I keep returning to in the show, especially because people will come to us and say, oh, you want to make the world all the same, right? And actually, like our desire is entirely counter that. I'm like, no, like let everybody be different.
Same is boring.
What we want is not for a world of sameness, but a world of difference, where that difference doesn't matter in terms of where you fall on a ladder of humanity.
Right.
You know what I mean?
I don't want two friends the same.
Yeah,
I don't want anything in life to be the same.
No, we should all be different.
It's interesting because what you used to hear in like the 90s, early 2000s, the saying was like, "Oh, I'm colorblind. I don't see color." No, it doesn't. No. I'm not racist. I don't see color. And it's like. But then you're saying you don't see me.
Exactly.
You don't see who I am, right? The point is not to not see color, but to not have it impact your interactions.
In fairness, I mean, people were guided to that.
Yeah, they were.
That's
society.
Well, and there's like a really specific history, and I don't know to what extent we really get into the details of it in the book, but the Canadian state, really has a lot to answer for to this, right? Because it was only in the aftermath of World War II that Canada explicitly decided we are going to stop being white supremacist explicitly. Yeah. And this is the origin of white fragility in a lot of ways, right? Because what caused it? It was the realization that white Europeans could do to other white Europeans what white Europeans have been doing to Africans and Asians and indigenous people for hundreds of years, and I'm talking about the Holocaust,
slaughter,
European people, Jewish European people. And when that happened, rather than embark on a process of educating people about race and racism and nationalism and how all these things come together, the Canadian state and all the provinces instead said, stop talking about it. Be colorblind. It is good to be colorblind, and we taught 3 generations of Canadians to stop thinking about race. But for people who are not white, right? Like, whiteness is the only kind of racialization that can be invisible. Because everybody else lives the reality of that race, right? In their everyday.
Yeah, no, and that's what I think people get lost in privilege, right? It's like because I was oblivious to things that you guys might go through, or other people that I know, my friends, my family, and things like that. That's my privilege. I don't think about that. I don't think about race on a day-to-day basis. I don't think about race, and that's my privilege.
In the same way that, like, you know, like we might not think about queerness. We might not think about our gender identity, right? Like, so it's intersectional. It moves in lots of different directions.
Like, I don't really have to consider my route home tonight if I'm going to walk home, because I don't really fear for my safety in the same way that somebody who's like a woman in the society might, right? Like, given the dynamics. So it's just like one of those things. Like, it doesn't make you a better person or a worse person. It's simply you're not in the intersection of that particular oppressive relationship.
It really comes down to micro details. You know, you start looking at like the intersections of all these different kinds of experiences. And I remember being like young, you know, in my early 20s, and starting to understand how gender operated and then race at the same time. And it was like, okay, it is unfair that society will view me walking down the street in a hoodie with deep fear and suspicion. But that is a thing that is happening. There's a young woman walking down this street and she's terrified of me. Now, maybe race is playing a part of that. But also, gender is playing a part of that. And men are really shitty to women too. So it's like, it's not ever one thing causing another. And I feel like in our history, in the settler colonial context of Canada, that's so important, because, you know, Matt, you mentioned earlier on about like people, white men in particular, feeling like when they get talking about privilege, it's like, well, shit's hard. I mean, and it really is. It really is, and it has always been. And this is the way that settler colonialism works, is that they took broke, like poor white working class people from Europe, and they brought them here and made them agents of settler colonialism. They incorporated them into this project. It's a very particular kind of historical movement that doesn't happen everywhere, but it happened here. And because of that, it becomes really difficult, right? Because there are a lot of struggling poor white people. And like Alex in particular, we say it in the book a lot, but Alex in particular talks about the fact that it's not because they're white. It's because of many other things. But it's not because
their lives are not hard. Like, the difference, living in a white supremacist world, means your life can be hard for all kinds of reasons, but it's not hard because you're white. Right? Whereas for other people, their lives could plausibly be hard because of
they're black.
The melanin content of their skin, right? Because they're coded that way in society, you know. But again, it doesn't mean, to repeat this point, because we repeat it all the time, it doesn't mean that white folks' lives aren't hard. My mom, again, I mentioned before, one of the whitest people on the planet. She and I get into this a lot, you know. I mean, because she had an incredibly hard early life experience, especially. You know, she lived for a decade in displaced persons camps in England. She was treated abominably by the English because she was an immigrant, refugee, because they were poor, living in a bombed out factory outside of London. You know, this kind of stuff. So, goddamn, that's hard. That's harder than anything I've lived through. You know, and she's a white person. She came here and managed to make a life for herself, which is amazing, right? So that struggle needs to be honored. I don't have any right to say that's not a struggle. But on the other hand, like, her life wasn't hard because of her racialized identity. And like that, you know, like in our society, like, it just matters so much. And it's not because it ought to matter, it's because it's been made to matter. I mean, one of the stories that, like, just to pick up on that thread that AJ was just talking about, I think really that I always try to hammer home with people who are like just starting out on their journey, it's that, like, if you know anything about the history of places like this, like, you should know that the number one thing the powerful were afraid of when they forced poor Europeans to come here and settle was that those people were going to go make common cause with escaped slaves and indigenous people. And the history of those maroon communities up and down the coast, fascinating, radical, amazing history of just humans working together and wanting to be free and wanting, like, recognizing common humanity. Those were the places that had to be destroyed, right? It was that coming together, you know? And so, we're a lot easier to manage when we're all busy fighting one another at the bottom of the heap versus wondering why we're fighting in the first place.
Yeah.
Wondering why, we've been socialized
why we're fighting
into
in the first place.
Totally, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So
it's so when you tell the story like about your mom, I also like there's a friend of mine who I've had this discussion with a few times about that, and he talks about like, well, I've had a really hard life. Like, I know his history, I know his story, and it's like, yeah, I understand where you come from, but the fact is that when you walk into a store, nobody knows your history.
right.
Yeah.
Right? No one's following you around because they know that you were like had a rough childhood or things like that, and like that's kind of thing. Like, you can walk down this nice neighborhood at 2 a.m.
and nobody wonders
and no one
about it.
one wonders about it because of your history.
Yeah.
Like, it's things like that
Totally.
I try to like help educate people on. It's like, but there's your privilege, right? Yeah, sure. Everyone has their struggles. I get it, man. Life isn't always easy, but it's not because of your skin color. Whereas other people who might actually be in the exact same situation you are, financially, whatever. But then on top of that, there's this other element of color.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things about intersectionality. I actually really just started reading about intersectionality about 4 years ago. And just it started off with diving down like the whole wage gap situation. And then that's what introduced me to like intersectionality and kind of reading more about that stuff. And it's fascinating, but obviously very tragic to like hear about like, when most of the numbers that come out from the United States, but it's like, it's with the gender and stuff like that, where it's like, a white man, if he makes $1, and there's all these levels where it's like, there's like a white woman and a black man and a black woman and a Hispanic man and a Hispanic woman, and it was something like crazy low where it was like a Hispanic woman makes like 43 cents on the dollar, kind of thing, right? 43 cents. It's unbelievable.
And just wait until if we ever get any real research about what has been done with the kids who've been separated from families at the U.S. southern border. Like, the Justice Department's just starting to release stuff. I know it's the U.S. context, but it's still compelling, where they're like, oh shit, these kids have been like, involved in child labor since they arrived, right? So, when, like, 'cause, you asked a really good question earlier about the, the jobs, like, I think how those things are weaponized to whip up white people especially into this kind of animosity against people further down the ladder. And that it makes so much sense because we're all struggling, we all want better lives for our kids, we want to live decently, we want to be told, we want to see that we play by the rules and we get a fair shake from it. Like, everybody wants that kind of stuff, right? So when it feels like that's not happening, you get really mad, and people have like tons of good reasons to be really, really mad right now, right? The problem is, of course, is that like when we're fooled from directing our anger at the appropriate targets, so the people who really have stolen our humanity, ground us up, made us like pay all this much more for groceries in the midst of a pandemic, even though the government should be policing price gouging, all this stuff. Then in those moments, that's when people are super vulnerable, and it's understandable that they would be ready to hear an easy story about good guys and bad guys, right? But it's, it's like, like, who stole your job? Walmart did steal your job, and they sent it somewhere else to exploit people for even less than they were paying. And then when they can't do that there anymore, they'll move it somewhere else.
And society kind of makes the same mistakes, and it's always that devil at the doorstep, and it's like, you should be mad at the I've heard, I'm not talking about politics, I said I wouldn't, I said I want to get into it, but you should be mad at the liberal elite. And I heard that statement, and I was so super mad for one moment, because I'm like, dude, you're almost ahead. We had a few things going on together, and I'm a center guy. I'm like a logic, check the box guy. I'm like, who's going to help me kind of get through next year? It was like one statement, and maybe that took off a lot of other hate. But I'm like, no, never. I don't name call, right? I don't name call on my politics. So lost my vote. Right. 100%, no matter what. So it gets harder and harder. Our political system is not the greatest
No.
menu.
No,
I have 2 million things to tell you about.
I know you do.
One other
That's why
time,
we're not going to talk about it today.
Yeah,
Right,
we're going to politics another day. But you know what? I kind of have 2 questions that kind of in my head. There is like just to kind of get your guys' opinion on. So back to quickly the Cornwallis thing is there was one idea that kind of came out of that I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts on it, and that was there was an idea that came from kids that some media outlet went and asked these kids, here's what's going on, what do you think that they should do? And what came out of their mouths and whatever that they decided was that keep the statue, but then add other statues.
Right.
Add statues of other people who have contributed to society and put their history and all that stuff in there. I don't know, what do you guys think about that idea?
I think it's a fun idea, and I think it reflects the kind of wonderful, jubilant innocence of children, right? And I love that, and anytime we can center that, I think is a wonderful thing. But I do think that the figure of Cornwallis, and I think it's relevant. We've talked a lot about Cornwallis, and I think we need to acknowledge for the listeners that this year, very recently, a few weeks ago, we lost a hero of Mi'kmaq history in Danny Paul, who's the author of 4 editions of a wonderful history book called "We Were Not the Savages," which, if you read no other history book about Eastern Mi'kmaq,
We Are Not the Savages.
We Are Not the Savages.
If you guys remind me, you can put a link up to that too.
Yeah, I would love that.
Super readable,
just out of respect. Yeah.
just amazing.
And he died this year, and one of his life goals was to basically try to fight against the glorification of Cornwallis, who was the man who put a price on the scalps of children and women and men, differential rates, and the whole politics, right? And it's such when I was coming back to Mi'kma'ki, because I wasn't politically aware growing up, I wasn't politically aware growing up. And I became politically aware elsewhere, and when I came back to Mi'kma'ki, I was like, you know what, I was quiet for my whole education in Halifax. I'm not going to be quiet anymore. And Dan Paul's book really helped me understand the long-term politics of anti-colonialism and with the role of Cornwallis and so many other things. So, I do think that the figure of Cornwallis is particularly grotesque and noxious and really violent and awful. So I do think that removing Cornwallis' statue is important. But for sure, we can put up lots of other great statues. But it doesn't mean we don't teach Cornwallis. This is the other thing, right?
Yeah.
We should never turn away from. I'm a historian, right? So I would never, and I think
we still teach about World War II.
Yeah, that's right. We still we don't have statues. Yeah, where's our statues of Hitler, right? We're not going to forget about Hitler because we don't have a statue,
right?
And Cornwallis.
Also, he's the measuring stick of everyone evil for the rest of time.
That's right. Yes. He set the bar.
I feel like we would justifiably have issues if people were talking about putting up statues to Hitler. You shouldn't put up statues to Hitler.
I mean, it was interesting because, was it the year after? I think it was the year after the Cornwallis campaign had at least gotten going. I think the statue was down, but maybe I'm wrong. But a bunch of us had organized. It was just as the first emergency phase of the pandemic was lifting. And a walking tour. Yeah, a walking tour of downtown Halifax was organized by a bunch of folks. I was asked to speak on it outside the old public library downtown, where the statue of Winston Churchill is. And Churchill was a much there's some people who really hate Churchill, right? He was an odious racist. He said he was a misogynist. He said terrible things. He was also absolutely central to the fight against the Nazis and rallied England at a time where, so I was asked several times by reporters who clearly, who were curious, but also expected me to be no, get it gone. I think Churchill, from my perspective, I won't speak for my co-author and co-host here, is a much more complicated. He was a legitimate giant of history in complicated ways, as well as being a total prick. but
I think he owned that.
But Cornwallis was simply he was a failed explorer, a failed administrator, a failed a failed military leader, and he was given the post here after all of that. So he really did, sure, he was the head bureaucrat in charge of the garrison that was Halifax, but he didn't do much more than that, other than trying to genocide the Mi'kmaq. So unlike Churchill, who legitimately you could argue had a list of accomplishments which need to be weighed against his odiousness, Cornwallis, what did he really how can you not imagine another administrator in that position? The British Empire had incredible influence, right? So it's also one of these things, who do we remember? How are we going to do it?
Right.
I'm always struck, I think, public commemoration of the past is always a tricky thing. But I love the history, and Halifax has some of this going on now, but in the South especially, I did some of my research in Mexico for years and years, and the wonderful tradition of public murals, these gigantic paintings on the sides of buildings. They're always they're filled with historical figures, but they're always complicated and dynamic in a way that statuary, I think, isn't. So at least if we're gonna commemorate complicated people, let's do it in a way that invites a conversation, that invites a real critical attention to be paid to their presence and their contributions.
I have this tweet up on my wall, but physical wall, because I liked it so much. I literally printed out the tweet and put it on my wall of my office.
Sure.
That says, I learned all my history from statues. What I've learned, people were tall, angry, and often rode horses, and they get shit on a lot.
That's fantastic. That's fantastic.
The mural thing's a cool thing, man.
Yeah.
Matt, we're probably going to have to close this up. We've been speaking for almost an hour and a half.
Oh, wow.
Oh, shoot.
Wow, right?
So,
That's fantastic.
before we kind of go, because we're on that kind of topic, though, is so I've been to Germany 3 times. We spoke earlier about Hitler and all this other stuff.
Yeah.
So what's really, really interesting about Germany, what they do, is they actually have huge museums and things like that are dedicated to this stuff, so that they don't forget.
Yeah.
But it's not hanging out in Parade Square type of thing, right? So I remember one of the times I was visiting Germany. I was in Leverkusen, and Leverkusen, Cologne area and everything. And what happened was there was this one particular day where they opened up a lot of things. A lot of things were not open, and in fact, they actually don't do tours in English. So it's not a touristy thing.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
It's really
That's great.
German. It's for Germans. And so the person I was staying with was like, would you like to go? I can just translate everything for you. And I am a huge World War II buff.
Yeah.
So I was like,
Yeah.
So we went, it was quite fascinating, quite moving in a lot of ways. So one of the places that we went, the upper part of it, it was a former SS prison type of thing, upstairs with the offices and stuff like that where they would have been, and that's where they had all the memorabilia. They had the posters that were there that was talking about the propaganda and all that other stuff, and they had other memorabilia, helmets, blah 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 blah. And downstairs where the actual cells were, you get to see them. They were closed off, and they were probably 4 feet wide, 12 feet long, and they would no joke. They said they'd put 40 people in there, and it's just amazing to see this stuff. And actually, one part that I found that was quite moving was written in German, carved into the wall, was "We can hear the Americans coming," and then pretty much right next to it was "Liberate." An American soldier signed it and said "Liberate" it and turned the date.
Wow.
And it was quite moving, right?
Yeah, that's amazing.
But what I found about this is that it wasn't glorified. It was really for education. These are never locked up. They're not saying they have certainly Auschwitz and all this other stuff that you can go and visit and everything. But these particular things where they had all the propaganda was locked up, and they didn't do English tours. It was for the Germans to be educated, and that's kind of the approach that I think we could take, something along those lines. Put them in places of learning.
Yeah.
Right? I think you're making a really interesting point, and Germany is certainly a great case study because of their commitment to denazification after World War II. And I really, I think there's something to that idea that if you, to some extent, one of the things that we talk about on the show quite frequently is this idea of like, don't make social change a spectacle. Like, you know, what you were saying before about like the status oriented stuff, right? Yeah. People want to be seen to be doing stuff, but not actually to do stuff, right?
Sure.
Like,
especially
sometimes
in the day of the influencer, right? I mean, you guys touch on this in your book also.
Yeah,
right? About
exactly. The grift.
Right, the grift.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I think, you know, like this is a great example because you can have now, you know, an avowedly, and again, okay, like I'm going to tread only lightly, and forgive me for this, but we live in a country with an avowedly woke prime minister who loves to talk about truth and reconciliation. Right. But practically speaking, like what that does when you have like these great public spectacles of like, sorry, you know, is it actually like provides an alibi for not doing the actual work, right? And arguably Germany, you know, while nothing is perfect, like really sought to confront the history of fascism in that country and how it took root at the grassroots. Right. And I think, you know, that's something that obviously I'm not trying to draw a direct analogy to Canadian settler colonialism.
No, of course. It's not the same.
But the point you're making, I think, is a great one, which is like, what if we imagined a process that wasn't about convincing the world that we're awesome and really nice and say sorry a lot, but was actually just about how can we like humbly come to terms with this history, this ongoing relationship, and find a way forward that lets us all be human, lets us all operate.
The Germans are 100 times more sophisticated than Canada is in terms of adequately and properly memorializing their pasts. Mm-hmm. And, you know, like I've only been to Berlin, and I've only been once, and it was almost exactly 7 years ago. And I still remember my partner literally, she'd probably be embarrassed about me saying this, but like literally crying because we had to leave Berlin.
Yeah.
You know,
really, wow.
She just loved it so much, and a huge part of that was like alongside the things that come from confronting the deep demons of your past is the art, the culture, the self-reflection, and all the other things that emerge from that. People think that it's just about a bad thing that we confront our past.
We have to give things up.
But it's not. It's what we gain when we actually look deep at what we've done and the things that have made the country, the state, or whatever the things that they are. When we confront those things, we can create things artistically, intellectually, socially, culturally, educationally that are miles ahead of where we were there. We can make quantum leaps. These things are possible, but it's not possible if we don't actually confront the demons in the closet. Skeletons.
Skeletons, demons, whatever.
Well, boys, I think that's a really way to go out on, right?
Yeah, I think
it's
so.
this non-stop learning journey for anyone. Really, it's just going to make your circle bigger, warmer, more fun for you, better ride through this journey as you live and die and not really sure what's going to happen. And what would you say there?
No, I think there's a better way to end that. I think that was pretty good, honestly. Right, and cool. Maybe we can plug there. You guys can plug your book one more time. Make sure that
we're going to plug the book.
Yeah.
I know this is a long-running episode. Maybe we can share a small excerpt of your book at the end of this podcast for those who just may want a taste of it. You guys narrated perfectly, by the way.
Oh, thanks.
That was nice.
Super fun to be in the studio.
It was nice to hear AJ for a while and then not hear AJ for a while. Respectfully.
The chapter by chapter thing was.
I was like, AJ's that's great. But no, you guys both narrated it beautifully.
Oh, thank
you so much. And I really enjoyed the voice and the emotion, right? When
we had
certain
a very good director who kept us on track.
Expertly done. So I really
so much.
enjoyed it.
It's awesome.
Thank you.
So I think we end that on a cheers, guys.
And on a cheers.
Yes. Well,
thank you.
Cheers. Thank you.
And to you guys too for having us on and
all right.
doing this podcast. It's great. Thank you so much.
Thank
awesome.
you.
Thanks.